Well, welcome everybody. Good evening. This is our fourth annual summer program. So you are all seniors in high school in the summer school of faith. So I would ask a favor of everyone that they turn off their cell phone if it happens to be on. Undoubtedly, there are times when the cell phone might go off as it's done over the years. So it reminds me one time several years ago when I was giving a presentation and a woman had a crying baby and she was embarrassed and got up and was leaving. And I said, Miss, that baby isn't bothering me. And she said, without missing a beat, no, but you're bothering the baby. So I hope that I don't bother your cell phones this evening. Before we jump into tonight's topic and kind of an overview of what we're going to cover over the next 5 Tuesdays here, the question comes up, why this subject? Why Christian apologetics, and why a topic like how we overcome barriers to the faith today in our culture? If you think about our topics over the last couple of years, last year we covered the Catholic social teaching of the church and got into different themes and applications of that. The year before, you might remember, we covered the first 500 years or so of Christianity, the fathers of the church. Some of you remember that, I hope. And then the year before that, we covered parts of the catechism. And so this topic is a little different because it's really about what is the basis for a reasonable grasp of the Christian or Catholic faith. And so if you look at the schedule of events coming up on the next page, these topics are driven by certain themes which we're going to get into. So tonight we'll talk a little bit about what is secularism. You might have heard that term before, secular thinking or secular progressives, that kind of thing. And often that's presented as, well, there's an opposition between science and religion, or faith and reason. And that's a very common thing in our culture today. The next topic is going a little bit deeper in the class next week of what is the evidence for God in physics and metaphysics, a branch of philosophy of metaphysics. The third class is covering another topic you will hear about, and especially today with what's going on in the news, that religion is inherently dangerous as a basis for society. And if societies have a religious base, that tends to be more dangerous than societies that are based on secular principles. And we'll examine that more closely. The fourth class is, again, if you think of someone who is not a Christian, not a Catholic, is kind of standing on the outside looking in, the Bible for us is a great source of consolation and guidance, but it can also be very confusing to someone looking in from the out because they hear all these different caricatures of what the Bible is, and it can actually be a barrier if one doesn't have the proper understanding of the Bible. Our last class then is what Pope Benedict, when he was Pope, talked about, which is probably the most prevalent feature of our society, particularly in the West, is what he called this dictatorship of relativism. Whether it is moral relativism or religious relativism, it pervades everywhere, and particularly in Western societies. And we'll talk about the alternative to that, which is what I've called true Christian freedom or liberation. So that's the program, and we'll get into more details of what each of those are really addressing as we go. So our class tonight is really to introduce our subject on what is Christian apologetics, what is secularism, and then deal with this false opposition of religion and science. And one of the key people we will engage with is Stephen Hawking, a very eminent theoretical physicist in the UK, who wrote a book about 5 years ago called The Grand Design, and we'll get into that. So what is Christian apologetics? It comes from a Greek word, apologia, meaning defense. For some of you who have read classical literature, the apology of Socrates is his trial and death. So traditionally it has meant a defense of Christianity. And you'll see that referred to throughout the history of Christianity as well. What apologetics throughout time has always been about is taking the various disciplines that we have, whether it's history, science, philosophy, literature, the arts, and use them and in effect elevate them to show the reasonableness of Christianity. It doesn't demonstrate Christianity, but it shows that it's not irrational and that it's historically based. Another purpose of apologetics is to help people, as I mentioned at the beginning, who have intellectual objections to Christianity, who think it's a religion for fools, who think it's a religion for people who are afraid, who use religion as kind of a pillow or a kind of crutch, an intellectual crutch to explain things that they don't understand, that we could understand in the sciences. So one of the very useful purposes of apologetics is to confront and offer to people who are not even Christian, who might be considering Christianity for the first time, that they don't have to park their mind, that they don't have to turn off their mind, that they in fact can engage on an intellectual level and understand the reasonableness of Christianity. You know, another purpose of apologetics is for those of us who already believe to strengthen our faith, to find evidences of it in what I'll call the natural order or the natural affairs of things. Our religion is not just whimsical, it's not just something that has no echo or correspondence in our human experience. And in fact, it ratifies and elevates that human experience. So Christianity is not this odd thing stapled onto human experience, but rather it is a illuminating aspect of all human experience. So it can strengthen our own faith as well. So those are really the two core reasons. Now, when we get into some of these themes, it'll sound very intellectual and very academic, and there will be times when you feel like, wow, this is very far removed from my faith in some ways. Sometimes people feel that way, and in no way am I ever going to be implying or suggesting that you argue your way to the faith the same way you might argue for some natural fact. For example, that Napoleon lived in the 19th century and here's the proofs, or a mathematical proof for the faith. That's not what I'm implying or suggesting at all. Faith ultimately is a belief in a person, Jesus Christ, and we believe what he has revealed. However, apologetics is also about supplementing that with the evidences from science, from history, philosophy, theology, of why that faith in Jesus Christ is also reasonable and not irrational. It might be supra-rational, but it's not irrational. And that's a key distinction that often people who are not Christian or Catholic don't make. And so that's what we are going to be talking about. Continuing, so really Christian apologetics is also about evangelizing the secular culture. It is one of the tools in the toolkit for evangelizing the culture. But in order to do that effectively, in order to connect with people, we have to know what I call the commitments. What are the entrenched themes and commitments that underpin secular culture today? And this, what I call confrontation or meeting of Christian apologetics with secular people, is really where our priorities should be from a leadership standpoint as well. If we are interested in converting the culture, we should know what are some of the intellectual underpinnings of that culture, particularly in the West and in our society. We do this so that we can clear away the barriers that block people from even considering Jesus Christ in the first place. If you grew up in a non-Christian home and all you knew about Christianity is what you heard on CNN or MSNBC, or just the caricatures that you read about in the culture or in movies, you would barely consider it. You'd think of it as kind of an odd leftover, like leeching or dueling from the 17th or 18th century. And obviously enlightened people don't consider these things anymore. So Christian apologetics is about addressing those people who are on the periphery. Many of them might be, I hate to say this, but they might be some of your kids. They might be in college. They might be friends or coworkers of yours. And if you don't have arguments, content to share with them, to draw them into a deeper conversation, they will never hear anything. Now that said, nothing replaces the example of a good example. You've heard the expression, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And that is certainly true in apologetics. It's what St. Paul referred to as the clanging cymbal. You can advance the greatest arguments in the world, but if you are a hypocrite, people are not going to hear it. So I will emphasize that aspect too. This course is going to focus more on the arguments, however, but always keep that in mind as you face colleagues at work or friends and family, that if you're not a shining example, maybe you should spend a little less time studying metaphysics and physics and work on a virtuous life. That said, our course over the next 5 weeks is about removing those intellectual barriers that people may have to coming to faith. So let's define secularism or a secular worldview a little bit more. And there's many ways you can dice this, again, in the popular media. I've put together 3 basic statements about what is commonly understood. And the first one is we can organize society, understand ourselves, have systems of governance without reference to God or religion. And in fact, that's a good definition of what most secularists or secular people hold today. References to God and religion in the public square are awkward and embarrassing and not needed and shop-worn. And we're much more enlightened now, and we have much better ways of establishing governmental bodies and rules for society without reference to God or religion or the Judeo-Christian philosophy, if you will. That's very commonly held out there. With that is kind of a hidden thought that religion is really just this historical organized superstition. Because with the natural sciences and the progress they've made, and Stephen Hawking in his book will dwell on this on some length, a lot of the reason why people believed in God and religion has been done away with through the natural sciences. So it's kind of organized superstition at this point, and many people believe that. The last statement here is, and religion is dangerous. Firmly held commitments lead to mass shootings in nightclubs. People who believe in religion extremely are dangerous. And extreme points of view like that have no place not only in public life but as a basis for public policy. It's inherently discriminatory and mean. You'll hear that a lot if you're reading the popular press and news reports. So that's the secular worldview defined. Let me get into now the specific themes that we will address in each course. So you saw the calendar of the topics. The first 2 that are bolded there are going to be what we cover in class 1 and 2. One of the reasons why people think that science has done away with the need for religion is because they have a particular view of what is knowledge, what is human knowledge. And human knowledge for the secularist and the atheist is basically all knowledge must be in the form of scientific knowledge to be true, to be valid. Must all take the form of propositions that can be justified by empirical data. The other theme that we will address in this class and then into class 2, because it's lengthy, is that actually the existence of God is knowable and can be demonstrated without appeal to the Bible or divine revelation or sacred tradition. And there are arguments that have been assembled throughout the centuries, starting with early Christian thinkers going to Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. And we will also read an argument from a current physicist who's also a Catholic priest, Father Robert Spitzer, reflecting the latest findings in quantum mechanics and relativity. And so that's probably one of the better arguments that I've come across in a long time that isn't just Thomas Aquinas dressed up in 21st century language. So when we get there for class 2, I will go through what I consider a convincing argument from reason alone for the existence of God. So that's what we'll cover in the first 2 classes. In the third class, being more specific, we covered what those themes will be, so I'll pass over that for now. Let's just deal with what I'll call the barbecue and cocktail party level of conversation just straight away, so that we can deal with it once, and then if you encounter this with your friends or coworkers, you can laugh this off. Look what they did to Galileo. I was at a barbecue not too long ago. That came up. Oh, how can you say that? Look how you treated Galileo 350 years ago. It's interesting they have to find something 350 years ago, but nevertheless, there it is. If you were to just do a survey of scientists in history, going back hundreds and hundreds of years, you would find many of them were Christian men and women of tremendous faith. Whether it is Copernicus, who actually was one of the original authors of what was called heliocentrism, where all the planets revolve around the sun, whether it's Kepler, or who discovered the elliptical pattern of orbits, or even Sir Isaac Newton, one of the giants of physics. These were all Christian or Catholic people. You could go down an entire list of people. You could go to Wikipedia and see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Catholic men and women and Christians who are eminent scientists. The father of genetics, and that should say heredity, not hereditary, but the father of genetics and heredity was a Catholic priest, playing with pea plants and noting that when he mated pea plants, green and yellow together, he saw the first generation of plants were yellow, then the next generation were green, and discovered heredity. And he is the father of our understanding to this day on genes and heredity. Father Lemaitre, who we'll talk more about, in the 20s began talking about what he didn't call it Big Bang, but the Big Bang cosmology, along with another scientist at the same time, Catholic priest, a Belgian Catholic priest. So we don't have all day, but please, if you're encountering this objection, it's a 4th grade objection. It's not a serious comment, and it's obviously false. I might add, just in homage to Galileo, that the Vatican operates one of the largest telescopes in the U.S. just outside of Tucson, Arizona. So Galileo somewhere is smiling, we hope, but just be aware that the Vatican owns and operates, and many universities and research think tanks, use that satellite for the data that it provides. So just be aware of these facts that make really laughable claims you will read, or sometimes you'll see a series on a television show, faith versus reason, as if that question is even a credible question. So keep that in mind. You could talk about the founding of universities in Europe in the 11th century, whether it was Oxford or the University of Paris or the University of Bologna, all founded in the 11th, 12th, 13th century. The entire major European system of universities was founded by monks. Many of the eminent schools in this country were founded by Protestants with a religious basis. So again, this so-called opposition between religion and science or academic inquiry is nonsense. It's ludicrous and it's ignorant. So continuing, I couldn't resist. This next page, the nuns. We have to get the nuns in. But realize that Catholic, Christian, laymen, laywomen throughout every state in the Union, throughout all of Europe, are in academic faculties, research labs, doing science. I had to pick these three nuns just because they were so interesting to me. But Mother Noella, PhD in microbiology. Sister Agatha, PhD in chemistry. And my favorite, because I do some work with cloud computing now, Sister Mary Kenneth Keller, who was a co-founder of the computer language BASIC at Dartmouth in the 1960s, along with a team of other scientists. But she did start one of the first computer science departments in the country. So again, you can see how laughable this false opposition is between religion and science. It's silliness. So continuing, it gets better. It gets better. The irony is that Christianity and the understanding in Genesis actually makes science possible as we understand it. The natural sciences, experimental science. You might say, Charles, why are you saying that? That seems an odd thing to say. After all, Genesis says the world was created in 7 days. So, or 6 days. God rested on the seventh day. So how on earth can you say that? Think about the headlines that come out of a Judeo-Christian grasp of creation, which was actually very much distinguished from the other religions and cosmologies of the time. The first is, and this is obvious to us, it wasn't obvious 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, and it's becoming less obvious today, I might add, but the world is not God. The world is created by God, and it's not God. So we understand trees and planetary orbits and the sun. We don't worship them. Now you might say or be thinking, well, Charles, that's not very earth-shaking. But it is. And it was for the time. And you can see how it's coming back into our secular culture, which is, I'll use the word pagan culture. Does anyone have a thought on how worship is coming back, this pagan worship of the earth is coming back into our culture? I'm sorry? Tree hugging. I would make the claim that the global warming movement in its extreme forms is a form of this worship of the earth. Again, these things have patterns and cycle through time, and so as Christians, we put a stake in the ground, say, God created the earth for us, and we don't worship it. That creates a clearing then to study it. Why study something that's magical, unpredictable, divine? If the world is divine in the sense that we might mean it, then why study it in any rational way? Because it's magical. We might do other things, we might sacrifice to it, but why study it? We can maybe control it through magic, but you wouldn't rationally interrogate it the way the natural sciences do. Secondly, the world is intelligible. Why? Because God created it with laws, universal laws. So the fact that the world is created by God and is not God, and that He created it rationally according to laws that we can discover, is the guarantee that the scientific enterprise is even worth pursuing in the first place. So Christianity and the Judeo-Christian understanding we get from Genesis actually makes the scientific enterprise possible and launched it throughout history, particularly in the West. So there's always a question at this point, what about the Greeks? They preceded Christ, they weren't Jewish. They started the academy, which is true, and they began the long march of science, which is also true. But if you think about the understanding from, let's say, that time to the 14th century, it remained static. One example quickly, Ptolemy. So Ptolemy was an astronomer, and the Ptolemaic system prevailed in Europe for 1,300 years until Copernicus. When medieval Christianity began to flourish, that's when the natural sciences began to flourish. When those universities that were started by the monks began to pick up momentum, that's when the natural sciences began to take off in the West. So continuing, before we jump into Stephen Hawking, there are certain rules of the road when reading any atheistic scientific text by an author. And I love this quote from John Lennox, who's actually a contemporary of Stephen Hawking when they were at Cambridge together. He's a professor of mathematics now. And if you get a chance to watch his YouTubes on Stephen Hawking, they're very interesting. But one of the things he talks about is not all the statements of a scientist are statements of science. Biases creep in. Preferences creep in. And as we'll see in Stephen Hawking's book, this very eminent theoretical physicist, basic logic errors and philosophical errors will creep in and they'll be obvious. And so keep that in mind is when people venture outside their field, they often get into mistakes. There's a reason for this, by the way. When you read books on cosmology or theoretical physics that go into these issues, there are always lurking what I call theistic traces or implications, namely the signature of God. And that's very uncomfortable when these theoretical physicists are speculating on origins of the universe, the self-sufficiency of the universe to cause itself, et cetera, et cetera. You always see these leaps in logic and errors because the alternative is really uncomfortable. And we're not talking about botany or something more tame. You don't get any of the controversies that we get with macroevolution and Darwin or other controversial areas. Why? Because there are theistic and therefore moral implications. People follow me on that? So if we're talking about photosynthesis, we're not going to get a lot of debate on how that process works. If we're talking about origin of the universe, we're going to get a lot of heat, a lot of debate, because there's a commitment to there not being a creator. There's a prior commitment to not having a God. These other disciplines, chemistry, geology, whatever they might be, less controversial. Why? No implications beyond the subject matter. So keep that in mind as well. Philosophers are guilty of the same thing. When the theory of relativity was published in 1905 and then another iteration of it in 1914, all of a sudden magazine writers, philosophers, even to this day, said, well, the theory of relativity means that now all points of view are relative to the person. If you haven't walked a mile in my shoes, you don't know. All of that nonsense comes from, not exclusively, of course, but this idea, well, everything's relative, which, of course, is not actually what the theory of relativity even said, but more on that later. So this is just the preamble to jumping into Stephen Hawking. So why don't we jump in? Why did I pick Stephen Hawking? You always have to go to the biggest bully and knock them down in the playground. It's just a fact of life. And Stephen Hawking is probably the most eminent theoretical physicist in the world. Some of you might recall he wrote A Brief History of Time. That sold over 20 million copies. It's been translated into many different languages. So he is probably the most esteemed theoretical physicist in the world. And he wrote this book, The Grand Design, with much fanfare and marketing in 2010 as kind of his summarization of the entire trajectory of his thought from the time he was a graduate student through a history of time, brief history of time. He wrote a revision of that even. And so let's see what he has to say. One of the first things he says in the beginning of that work is philosophy is dead. It hasn't kept up with the latest developments in physics. It's a spent discipline. It doesn't provide sufficient explanations anymore, if it ever did. And actually, physics, it falls now to physics and theoretical physicists to provide answers to life's questions. So free will in the human person, if you think that free will really exists, you're kidding yourself. It's actually just the stimulations of neurons in your brain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting is Stephen Hawking's book is largely philosophical, as you will see. He traces the history of thought. He goes through the Enlightenment, and Enlightenment means what I was referring to earlier, as we advance from religion, which was a crutch, an intellectual substitute for real knowledge, which we gain from science. Hi, Emery. And people referred to God or the gods to explain things they simply didn't understand. So we had sun gods because we saw the sun move, and we had to have a god for that. We experienced love in our lives, so we had to have a god for that. We saw strife and conflict in the world. We had gods for that. On and on and on. As the natural sciences progress, we show how silly those things are. And this is often referred to as the God of the gaps. Have people heard that expression before? The God of the gaps is an expression that secularists use and atheists use against religious people to say that's your button you hit when you can't explain things that can be explained by science. You just invoke God. So a cathedral crashes in Lisbon, Portugal, and kills 700 people. You guys think that that's some kind of strange hand of God. And actually, it's just a roof collapsing and killing 700 people. So let's not get emotional about it. God of the gaps is the default position of believers. That's what atheists will often invoke, and that phrase you will see often in all the literature on this. Hawking goes on to say physics actually provides the best explanations. Why? Because its mode of knowledge that we talked about earlier is empirical. I can verify it by pointing to an experiment. Recall earlier I said that was one of the key themes we're going to address today of that type of claim, that all knowledge to be true knowledge must be empirical, subject to experiment, etc. He will then, this is his wind-up, the pitch will be that M theory, multiverse, is the explanation of the origin of the universe. You don't need to appeal to God or the gods for the existence of the universe. The existence of the universe can be explained by M theory, which is a theory that combines relativity, quantum mechanics, and Big Bang cosmology. There's no need to appeal to something supernatural. Why do that? We don't need to do that according to Stephen Hawking. Everything arose from nothing. So let's go to some of the quotations of Stephen Hawking from The Grand Design. The first one, and this is early on in the book, within the first 5 pages. What is the nature of reality? Where did it all come from? Did the universe need a creator? Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. You see, I didn't make that up. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. And he continues, and this is how he flies through 3,000 years of human thought. Ignorance of nature's ways led people in ancient times to invent gods, to lord it over every aspect of human life, since the connection of cause and effect in nature was invisible to their eyes. These gods appear inscrutable and people at their mercy. But with Thales of Miletus, he was one of the first pre-Socratic philosophers we have on record, about 2,600 years ago, that began to change. The idea arose that nature follows consistent principles that could be deciphered. And this is my emphasis. And so began the long process of replacing the notion of the reign of the gods with the concept of a universe that is governed by the laws of nature and created according to a blueprint we could someday read. If I was to finish that quotation, that language is mathematics. That's the language that we can read the universe in. Continuing toward the middle part and the latter chapters of his book, he will conclude, we will describe how M theory may offer answers to the question of creation. According to M theory, ours is not the only universe. Instead, M theory predicts that a great many universes were created out of nothing. Their creation does not require the intervention of some supernatural being or God. Rather, these multiple universes arise naturally from physical law. That's a metaphysical claim as well as a claim of physics, as you can tell. All of these claims are not actually primarily claims of physics. From these three quotations, these are all claims in philosophy, a discipline he supposedly thinks is dead. Now, my goal here in showing this next slide is not to explain Big Bang cosmology in 4 minutes. But I do want to give you a visual picture that is on Stephen Hawking's website. And this is not really controversial, and it shouldn't be controversial for us. This is it's probably the consensus model among physicists and astrophysicists of origin of the universe, or what's called the Big Bang, or Big Bang theory. Now, it has an interesting history. We won't go into all of that, not able to and not have the time, but suffice it to say, the Big Bang cosmology is an explanation of how our universe came to be and how it has its shape that it does today. Now, in looking at this picture, I don't want you to think that there was an explosion of an initial condition, a singularity, sometimes people refer it to, into pre-existing space. The image I want you to think about is a balloon being blown up, and the explosion is the breath. So the Big Bang creates space and time as it expands. There's not an explosion into some pre-existing set of conditions. Rather, the explosion creates space, creates time. It's a little counterintuitive to how we might think about it. But if you think about a balloon being blown up and expanding, that's a good way of thinking about Big Bang cosmology. Now, what's interesting is, and I won't read all of the subtabs of this to you, but we have experimental verification, I should say empirical verification of Big Bang cosmology. So there are strong indications that this is in fact a correct view of origin of the universe. I'll just mention a few. People may have heard of the Hubble telescope. The Hubble telescope and the scientist Edmund Hubble was very provocative and influential in talking about the expansion of the universe. He saw what were called redshifts of stars moving further away. The same way when you hear a sound moving towards you and away from you, you hear its pitch change, like a train coming at you. It goes, "Meow." That's a Doppler effect. Light operates the same way. And what Hubble was able to see and conclude was that That kind of is like a little mood music. We should dim the lights. Right. Bob, is that you? Be honest. No, okay. All right. But Hubble was able to see the same kind of Doppler effect we hear on a train platform when a train goes whizzing by through observing the phenomenon of light receding away from us. There are other verifications of this too more recently of an expanding universe by something called the cosmic microwave background radiation, which is essentially what's been described as the heat remnant left over from the Big Bang. Because when something explodes and expands quickly, there's a heat signature at the periphery that we are able now to measure with probes, this WMAP probe that is relaying data back over many years between 2001 and 2010. The readings are quite fascinating. Even for a non-specialist like myself, if you read interpretations of this data, it is very interesting. But it also indicates the expansionary nature of our universe. I will mention two things and then we can move on from this because I know this isn't specifically what the course is about, but it's important to have a baseline understanding of what's at stake. Part of Big Bang cosmology assumes, or requires, I should say, that there was an initial condition. A singularity is sometimes how it's described. Father Lemaitre, the physicist who Einstein actually said best understood his thought on relativity, I'll say that again, a Catholic priest was quoted, Einstein was quoted in a lecture once saying this Catholic priest understood his theory of relativity better than anyone else he'd ever read. I won't say that a third time. But Father Lemaitre called it a primeval atom, this initial condition that led to this rapid explosion and expansion in the universe. What Stephen Hawking in his book will do is say this was, and I'll say preceded because there was no time before the singularity, so I'll say preceded in quotes by a vacuum that experienced quantum fluctuations, turbulence, which generates multiverses. Now, I want to be fair to Hawking. He goes at great length to talk about quantum mechanics, how that is the basis for this generation capability of multiverses. We don't have time to go into that tonight. It might be too much to ask. But he is connecting several ideas from quantum mechanics, the theory of relativity, to locate this mechanism for generating multiverses in this quantum field, and that's what he calls nothing. This quantum vacuum, which is nothing, has nothing, is capable of fluctuation, however. And that's what will be the basis for generating multiverses. So just continuing then, and then we will go to a summary of his argument and then the critique. Our universe is one of infinitely many, thus multiverse. And these universes, he uses the expression bubble up, in and out of existence constantly. Ours is one of many that have bubbled and will bubble in and bubble out. But this is his explanation for why you don't need God, you don't need a creator, because through these quantum fluctuations in a vacuum, I'll say adjacent to the Big Bang, it's just the mechanism by which all universes are generated. So nothing is literally what has caused this, and nothing more is required. We don't need a God. We don't need this idea of religion or a creator. You see how he is far strayed from his discipline at this point on these claims that he's making, as we will soon see. So, to summarize, and then we'll take some brief questions, and then we'll pivot to our critique. The Big Bang cosmology indicates that our universe has started from an initial explosive condition. It expanded rapidly. There are heat remnants, signatures in our universe that indicate this expansion. As I said, for Hawking, these universes bubble in and out of existence from this quantum fluctuation in a vacuum that generate multiverses. No need for a creator. Obviously, one needs a background in physics to do justice to all of Hawking's argumentation. But we're interested in the philosophical implications of it. Notice I didn't say religious implications of it. We're interested in the philosophical implications. Does this even make sense philosophically without the aid of divine revelation, without the aid of the Bible? That's what we're interested in. Now, this is the standard view of most textbooks in physics. I went to the library. I looked at the CLC curriculum in physics. You go to half price off books, you'll see all the high school and college textbooks. This is what's being taught to students. So you can see the need for apologetics is serious. This is what's being filled in their minds. So to the point where young people will conclude, well, maybe my religion I got from my parents is just kind of like celebrating St. Patrick's Day or the Christmas tree. I mean, it's just nice things I did in the past with my family, like going to church or praying, but, there you go. I don't know what that meant, but there you go. All right. So I'd like to do the critique in two steps, a general critique of what I'll call scientism or naturalism, and then a more specific assessment of Hawking. So recall what I said at the beginning, that one of the linchpins of secularism and secular society, that all valid knowledge, all knowledge, must take the form of scientific knowledge to be true, to be valid. But think about that claim for a moment. If someone says to you, I am a rational person, I will only think what can be based upon empirical evidence. Everything else is just poetry. What's the empirical basis for that claim? Would you point to an experiment for me that shows that all knowledge is based on experiment? What's the experiment in the laboratory? You've had 3 comments now, Emery. Your quota is complete.
Yeah.
So what's the basis for that? There's water in the back. What's the basis for that claim? You see how silly it is to say, well, let me show you the claim assumes its own conclusion. So when you meet these people, and you can think of them in popular culture, Christopher Hitchens, for example, who's passed away. I only am going to believe and think what I can prove or someone can show me a proof for. Right, but think about that claim just for a moment. On its face, it's self-contradictory. It's a circular argument. So, and yet that is a staple of atheists, that I will only believe what can be verified by my senses or instruments that measure phenomenon. What's another one here? The scientific method, I'll just read this, confirmed by repeatable quantifiable experiments, is self-sufficient. Does not rely on anything that cannot be demonstrated through experiment, as I just said, and is the only basis for making claims. That's not even true in the practice of science. There are things that science uses, whether it's in labs or theoretical physics, that are from other disciplines that itself does not demonstrate. So even if you conceded the first point, yes, the empirical method is the only method, you'd pretty soon be saying, well, what's this thing called mathematics? Isn't it interesting that we can accurately describe laws of nature through something we invented called mathematics, which, by the way, is the language of physics, and it's the language that Hawking refers to by which we read the universe. And yet physics doesn't demonstrate mathematics either. Think of the rules of logic. Induction, deduction. So induction, you see sample A, sample B, sample C. All these samples have a certain quality or property. You make a conclusion. Think of someone in a lab. Does this mixture kill cancer cells? And they do tests under different scenarios, and they reach a conclusion. They make an inference from the data that yes, this compound kills cancer cells. Why? Because in the 82 simulations we did, it did. These rules of logic, the rules of inference, aren't empirical. We bring them to the experiments. They aren't demonstrated. How can you demonstrate the tools by which you demonstrate things in general, which is what inferences are? So the whole field of logic, which is part of philosophy, physics relies on. And the so-called empiricist relies on. He relies on mathematics, which he didn't demonstrate, which was created by the human mind. He relies on this odd thing called logic, which isn't empirical, and he didn't demonstrate. In fact, uses to demonstrate things. You see how it's not so simple to say, I just believe based upon empirical methods, and I'm not going to believe anything else that can't be verified. Well, you've already are using things that you can't verify. So why would you think an act of Christian faith is irrational if you're doing the same thing in the exercise of any discipline in the natural sciences? We make natural acts of faith every day. I make a natural act of faith when I order Thai food and the guy delivers it, and he didn't put a staple in the peanut sauce. Or if I'm driving on a 2-lane highway, I'm making an act of faith the oncoming guy isn't going to go right into my lane. We do this every day. Natural acts of faith without evidence, we do every day. We wouldn't leave our home otherwise. So you see how silly and dishonest people who make these statements, I only will think what's based on evidence that's empirical, they're kidding themselves. And as we saw earlier, they're kidding themselves for a reason. Okay. Let's continue. So a more specific critique of Stephen Hawking's work. Remember my comment, God of the gaps. Religious people use God to fill in where their knowledge is lacking. And they use God as just another cause in the causal chain of things to explain. And so God, the God of Christianity, the God of Judaism, is just another link in the chain that science will explain. That is not the Judeo-Christian understanding of God. God is not just another link in a mechanical chain, and he's just holding the first chain, which happens to be at the beginning of the universe. That is a stilted view of what Christians mean by God. What Christians mean by God is that, in the beautiful expression of Thomas Aquinas, ipsum esse subsistens, the sheer act of being in its fullness, in its perfection, without limit. The ground of all being, the infinite, the thing that is just beyond any human expression. So what Christians mean by God is completely different than what Stephen Hawking thinks Christians mean by God. Next point, when he is bashing metaphysics in philosophy, I have some sympathy for him because the way philosophy is taught in most universities in this country, I would think the same thing as Stephen Hawking did about it. if you look at the programs that are offered today, they are far and away removed from the natural sciences. And the affinity that should exist between philosophy and the natural sciences is really a distant memory, unfortunately. And if you look at the subject matter that philosophy departments focus on today, it is often, and majority of the time, it's laughable and ridiculous. Most people take philosophy in college to get that easy elective. Let's be honest. They're accounting majors, they're business majors. Oh, I have to take I'll take the intro philosophy class, and we'll read about Descartes, we'll read about Immanuel Kant, we'll read about Hegel, we'll read about Sartre because he's a Frenchman in the 20th century, and that's kind of cool. And they walk away from that thinking, this is nonsense. And they're right, if that's what philosophy was. We're going to get into metaphysics more in class 2, but metaphysics is a discipline that studies, and this will sound odd, and I hope to make it more clear in class 2, but metaphysics is a discipline of philosophy that studies being as such, or the different ways things exist, and characterizes them in a more ultimate way. Things like substance and properties, infinite, finite, things that are, as I put here, cause and effect. What do we mean by those terms truly? Things that are necessary, things that are contingent. All these are terms used in metaphysics to characterize the ultimate nature of all reality. You can see it's a discipline that stands above all the natural sciences and makes them possible, actually. Logic being, frankly, a branch of metaphysics. If we continue, that multiverses arise from physical law, the comment earlier is relevant here. Physical laws, whether they be the law of gravity, quantum fluctuations in a vacuum, by themselves are not causal. They're not causal agency, as I put it here. They do not cause anything to come from nothing. Laws don't cause reality, as we'll get into in a second. And as someone said earlier, to be subject to quantum fluctuations is to be something. That's not nothing. That's not nothing. So in the end, as the book ends, I felt kind of sad because I was hoping Hawking would actually advance the ball down the field. But he didn't give an ultimate explanation then of the origin of the universe, because the mechanism now is in need of explanation. He actually might be right in terms of how a vacuum, when it's disturbed by quantum fluctuations, could generate universes. That might be the case. But to say that that is an ultimate explanation of the origin of the universe or universes is silliness, it's madness. Something from nothing. Let me give an example. We're okay on time, by the way. Of what constitutes an explanation in the first place between science, the natural sciences, and metaphysics. John Lennox, in some of his YouTube lectures, talks about the invention of the jet engine. I'll use a more simple example of an automobile. If you think about it, the natural sciences and engineering are necessary to explain not only how the vehicle works, but how it should be designed and engineered and tested, and so on. And you have to have an understanding of various branches in physics, whether it's mechanics, thermodynamics, electronics, whatever it might be. Those disciplines have to be understood and tested, and so you can produce vehicles. All of those laws, think of the frictional force on the ground, braking distance, fuel economy, noise and vibration inside the interior of the vehicle, all those laws that govern how those are harmonized by engineers so that we have a drivable vehicle, don't produce existence. They describe the properties of things. Now, the little silly example I use, again improvising off John Lennox, is the law of mathematics of 2 plus 8 doesn't put $10 in my pocket. The law of addition is great. It doesn't put money in my wallet. It doesn't produce existence. Why not? It doesn't have what in metaphysics we call causality. Do you heat a tub of water with the laws of heat or combustion of a fuel source? Does your tub naturally get, I have a book, I'll hold it near the tub, explaining all the laws, and that bathtub water is going to warm up? Of course not, right? Laws of nature cause nothing. They are nothing other than descriptions. So you can see one of the problems Hawking has is, as he has drifted out of his discipline of physics into metaphysics, he's making mistakes, category mistakes. And in fact, in metaphysics, nothing is the absence of anything. It is nothing. For Hawking, nothing is actually something in need of explanation, which is why I said it's not an ultimate explanation. Remember when I said this is a philosophical critique? One doesn't have to be religious to ask these questions. And many people I know who are atheists and agnostics ask these very questions and are also dissatisfied with Hawking's answers. You don't have to be religious to ask these questions. They're provocative. They show the inadequacy of physics as a discipline left to itself as an ultimate explanation, certainly. The truth is, the fact that there is something rather than nothing is remarkable, highly improbable, and what's even more improbable is that we're even here. I'll leave that to the side for now, but that's what's remarkable. That's what's in need of explanation, not some other counterfeit explanation. This might be in different order in your deck, but I wanted to move this quotation ahead, one page. So David Bentley Hart is actually an Eastern Orthodox theologian, but he wrote a work, I'll say 7-8 years ago, called Atheist Delusions. If you would like a very spicy, polemical work on the silliness of the new atheism and secular progressives, please get this book. You will enjoy it immensely. I will be quoting from it and others throughout this summer. But he summarizes well the points I'm trying to make. Quote, "There is, after all, nothing inherently reasonable in the conviction that all of reality is simply an accidental confluence of physical causes, without any transcendent source or end. Materialism is not a fact of experience or a deduction of logic. It is a metaphysical prejudice, nothing more, and one that is arguably more irrational than almost any other. In general, the unalterably convinced materialist is a kind of childishly complacent fundamentalist, so fervently, unreflectively, and rapturously committed to the materialist vision of reality that if he or she should encounter any problem, logical or experimental, that might call its premises into question, or even merely encounter a limit beyond which those premises lose their explanatory power, he or she is simply unable to recognize it." Continuing, the question of existence, which is what we've been talking about, does not concern how it is that the present arrangement of the world came about from causes already internal to the world, but how it is that anything, including any cause, can exist at all. It is a question that no theoretical or experimental science could ever answer, for it is qualitatively different from the kind of questions that the physical sciences are competent to address. And then later in the book, no matter how fundamental or simple this level reached by the scientists, protoplasm, amino acids, molecules, subatomic particles, quantum events, unified physical laws, a primordial singularity, mereological possibilities. Existence is something else altogether. Even the simplest of things and even the most basic of principles must first of all be, and nothing within the universe of contingent things, nor even the universe itself, even if it were somehow eternal, can be intelligibly conceived of as the source or explanation of its own being. You see what he's driving at there is that the discipline of the natural sciences never touch the core question. They never touch it, namely the problem of existence. Why is there anything at all? How is there anything at all? Appealing to some physical law already gives the game away, because that physical law can't explain itself as we have seen. It can't give ground to itself. We can always ask the next question: what were the conditions for that law that arose for that law? So if we now continue, let's make some conclusions, and this will tee up the next session as well. This will sound harsh. I also threw a little humor in just to make sure people were still with me. But in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, people like Stephen Hawking and other kindred spirits that you could point to in theoretical physics, who are atheists and who write polemically and recklessly like this, this is not an advance in thinking. This is a regression. This is back to magic. Something from nothing. That's a good definition of what Aboriginal tribes would do to ensure fertility, rolling bones on the ground of their enemies, or making sure the crops are good next year, so we'll do some odd ceremony. This is what something from nothing means. Magic. So when theoretical physicists talk this way and dive into metaphysics, not only do they come off silly, but it's a regression of thinking. We are polluting our thinking. I also am in a spicy mood here. I think I had a glass of red wine when I was writing this. But frankly, there's more evidence for the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ than there is for M theory. Why do I say that? At least the evidence for the physical resurrection is in this universe, and there's testimony about it. And it can be verified empirically, by the way. We will never find the bones of Jesus Christ. I can say that emphatically. So there's this prior commitment to atheism. There is this prior allegiance. And it creates this dilemma. Any mechanism that's postulated or hypothesized to explain origins of being, we can always ask the next question. Well, what gave rise to that? There's this deferral, this indefinite deferral that's inherent in the discipline of any law, of any physical description. This is part of the pivot now to our class 2, but the way Hawking gets around this, because he even makes some concessions in the book that this sounds strange, is infinity, actual infinities of universes, to explain the strangeness of our universe. So the first thing you do when you have a strange occurrence is to say, well, it comes from an infinity of possibilities. And that's why we're here. It's a bit like the person who survives being executed by a firing squad, and the squad consists of 10 crack-shot Marine veterans, and he survives it. And he says, well, of course I survived it. Of course they missed. I'm here, aren't I? Well, that's no explanation. That's not an explanation of why 10 people from 30 feet missed you. Well, it's highly improbable. Well, I'm here. That's not an explanation. That's not even a scientific explanation. So, to wrap up, this lack of ultimate explanation in the natural sciences of origin of universe, of origin of existence, inherent to the discipline is the door to metaphysics. It's the door to wisdom. It's the door to wonder and awe that there's something rather than nothing. And so, it is the door for considering arguments for the existence of God without the aid of revelation. It's a comfort to have revelation, don't get me wrong. But there are arguments that we will look at in Class 2 that are arguments from reason alone for the existence of God. So, as I say at the end here, it's an advancement in thought. We're making progress when we slough off bad thinking, regardless of whether they have a PhD behind their name or not. We slough off bad thinking. It's progress to then consider arguments by what we might consider deep thinkers, people who have pondered these issues in a very profound way. But we should also, as Christians and Catholics, recognize that when science becomes religion, it's no longer doing its job. So I go full circle. Christianity made possible the rise of science. And it falls to us to make sure we maintain the integrity of science as a discipline. Otherwise, as we see, science gets polluted when it's made into religion. So that will be the basis then for what we consider in Class 2, which is the evidence for God's existence in physics and metaphysics. Are there any questions before we wrap up? Yes?
I thought I had read somewhere that early in his career, Stephen Hawking used the term God particle in place of...
So the question is, Stephen Hawking in some of his early works may have made reference to something called the God particle. Now there are works by other physicists, perhaps later, who also refer to that. I don't know that he referred to that in any way that would imply he thought that. Yeah. Yes, question here. So, thank you. So the question is, in some of Hawking's earlier writings, like A Brief History of Time, he says, we're trying to understand the mind of God. Has he departed from that in this latest work? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. There's been an evolution in his thinking toward this atheistic bent. Yes? Oh, I love mathematics, actually. And one of our first arguments in Class 2 will be the law of entropy. And actually, big numbers make things even less likely over time. Maybe I'll use next time not the example of a firing squad, but me at the golf range aiming at a target and the odds of me hitting that target. They get much worse as time goes on. Very good. Well, with that, thank you all for coming this evening. Class 2 next week.